Hello, everyone. I invite you to please take your seats for this event. We are about to start with our event at the Titano Theater. You can't hear? Okay. Okay, that does work, I think, now. Welcome to the Titano Theater in the Republic of San Marino. And I'm really happy to see such a warm audience here today for the Lectio magistralis by Lord Norman Foster. I will give a very short introduction so that we can delve directly into the contents of this meeting. And so, Your Excellencies, dear audience, to introduce an architect such as Norman Foster is not an easy task. Those of you in this room who were trained as architects know already that we are dealing with the 1999 Pritzker Prize laureate, possibly the most prestigious recognition that an architect can get. After he studied in the UK and the US, Lord Foster co-founded his first studio in 1963, the Team 4, before establishing Foster Associates in 1967. Today, his career spans over 6 decades, a time long enough to see the world changing drastically. Because of my profession, I am a journalist at Domus, a magazine founded by architect Gio Ponti almost 100 years ago. I often ask myself what the public knows about our field. I quickly learned during my studies in architecture that my way of amare l'architettura, or loving architecture, as Gio Ponti said, coincided with making it readable for those who have not been in contact with the discipline before. Not because everybody must be interested in architecture, but because, hopefully, citizens would then be more conscious of what are the possibilities for the spaces they inhabit. This is because I believed, and I still believe, that architecture is inherently public. Our lives unfold in buildings and design spaces. This is what makes the work of Norman Foster so fascinating to me. His interventions speak both to the passers-by and to the inhabitants. They are built around the idea of well-being of a community. They are meant to last through transformations and adaptations to ever-evolving needs. You may be familiar with the recent project for Apple Park in Cupertino, first conceived by Lord Foster with Steve Jobs around the needs of the employees. But some of you may be less familiar with the Willis Building in Ipswich. Completed in 1975, these headquarters for an insurance company were born out of the same research, namely around the idea that a workplace is, first and foremost, the place for a community. You may have strolled in Hong Kong and noticed the high-tech facade of the HSBC building, or walked under the reflective canopy of the old port of Marseille, or up the dome of the Reichstag in Berlin, or maybe you have landed at the terminal designed by London Stansted Airport, by Lord Foster for London Stansted Airport. Lord Foster's work is disseminated all over the world, but what is relevant today is the optimistic attitude that stands behind his design thinking. This spirit permeates the work of his Norman Foster Foundation with UNECE and with director Paula Deda. In this framework, the Declaration of San Marino is a much-needed response to decades, if not centuries, of an extractive relationship with our planet. In this moment of fear and uncertainty, seeing all the different actors involved in the production of our built environment coming together to sign this declaration is encouraging. But now it's time to act without leaving no one behind. Please allow me to welcome Lord Norman Foster to this stage.
Your Excellencies, Minister, colleagues, and honored guests. I was here yesterday to give the keynote to help promote the United Nations Declaration of San Marino and its principles. And that was about sustainability, inclusivity, planning, urban design, and architecture. And there are a few images here from that, but it's an expanded version really there's a kind of hierarchy in that green list. Sustainable, inclusive, so for all the citizens of a city. It's about planning, and it's about urban design and architecture. You note that although I'm an architect, I put architecture last. That's not because it's vitally important to the environment, but because the infrastructure, the connectivity, the public spaces, the connections, those are really the DNA of a city. And perhaps my walk from the Parliament to this building is an example of that. The memory that I will take away when I leave San Marino will be of its public spaces, of its extraordinary, beautiful scale, the stone, the materiality, those outdoor rooms. And then that leads us to here, and the extraordinary surprise of discovering an Art Deco theater in a historic shell of a building. So the manifesto is really, it's not a manifesto, it's called a declaration, but it is a manifesto for a sustainable future. A future where we're combating the challenges of global warming, of rising sea levels, of pollution. And that declaration is related back to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And the spirit of those, which for me, starting practice in the 1960s, which was really the birth of what was later to be called the Green Movement, informed the foundation, its educational program, and its involvement with the United Nations, with the Forum of Mayors, engaging with cities' civic leaders who have the power to respond to these extraordinary challenges of our time. And I was asked by the Secretary General to give an address at the General Assembly in New York on behalf of the design professions to stress the importance of master planning. And yesterday I was asked to share the experience of myself and my colleagues with some examples to try to bring to life the concept of master planning. And I started with the example of a city called Duisburg at the confluence of the Rhine and Ruhr, which was once, like so many Rust Belt communities today, in the past was a thriving center of heavy industry. The master plan has developed over the decades and started in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, industry had left, and there were the relics, noble relics of industrial buildings from the past. And the waterway still active. So the challenge with the master plan, starting with the inland harbor, at the time of its creation, the largest in the world, inland waterway, and to work outwards, guided and transformed this Rust Belt community into a thriving center of leisure, of culture, and of new industries. And in the 1980s, these were some of the buildings that we injected into that fabric, together with landscaping, bicycle paths, to encourage new, clean, technological industries. And at the same time, we started creating a new infrastructure of water that would connect to the harbor. And here you can see that under construction, and that becomes in a way, the catalyst. It becomes the spine for a new kind of affordable rental housing, setting a new standard with outdoor terraces and spaces, and at the same time creating green spaces. This was taken at the time of the inception. I think it would be interesting to revisit with the trees mature and the landscaping taking place. We brought the river back to life as a tourist destination, and we dammed the larger basin to create a center of leisure and sport. I emphasize that this was a bottom-up approach. It was really working with the community and the civic leaders. If that was one example of a master plan, then a second is in Hong Kong, West Kowloon to be precise, as a kind of extension of the city. And here you can see it as a three-dimensional computer-generated image. What I'm not sure you'll be able to see, but in the kind of bottom left projection, there's a yellow line. And that was really an extension of Hong Kong. So how do you recreate another part of an existing city with an emphasis on culture? Well, our starting point was to try to identify the DNA of Hong Kong itself. And that started in the age of a computer with a sketch, a series of sketches to identify those characteristics, to try to abstract them out and to distill the best of those urban qualities, but at the same time to alleviate, to take away the pollution, the congestion of traffic. So that led, as you'll see, to a kind of multi-layered solution. But first, the analysis. You'll see a proliferation of signs. You also feel a certain proportion of the main streets and the alleyways. So this is just a very, very small extract from that master plan. In the same way, I'm only showing you a glimpse of the previous one, Duisburg. So when you abstract that out, and then you find the percentage in the visual field of each of those elements, that then becomes a design tool to recreate the extension of that. And this is that extension in the pedestrian plane. It's not totally pedestrian. We would allow a certain number of emergency vehicles access, but as you can see, it's a multi-layered solution. So the congestion, the movement is siphoned off the emergency services, the deliveries, to a lower level. That then extends out and it embraces the green spaces. Here you can see then the recreation of a typical street, the heavy traffic below, priority to pedestrians, and continuing the DNA of the signage, the colors, the textures, and creating a grand park related to the water. This is in Asia, and Asia and Africa will be where the urban explosion between now and 2050. And typically of a city in Asia, in Africa, and of course to a lesser extent in South America, you'll find the formal city, and then alongside it, the informal city. And the informal city is made of the materials which are to hand. So here is predominantly blue, because the predominant materials are corrugated tin and blue plastic covering. And we're talking about 14% of humanity who don't have access to electricity, power, for heating, for cooking, modern sanitation, adequate shelter, clean water. And I had one conversation with an individual called Ratan Tata. And out of that conversation, I made a proposition which I've been sharing with students, that perhaps there was a better way to transform whatever you call them, the slums, the informal settlements, rather than relocating to transform, because in many ways, many of the towns and cities that we take for granted have evolved over time. So that idea took root, and then you can see the top left image is Ratan Tata in the middle and the governor of a state of Odisha. And the key was handing out ownership, land certificates. So the citizens in those informal settlements would have rights and would enable them to, with help, transform the present dwellings eventually into a modern dwelling with modern sanitation. I should emphasize that this is the only project that I'm showing of the foundation. The rest is with my colleagues at Foster & Partners and the many collaborators around the world. So at this ceremony, where we participated handing out land certificates, led to a visit to a nearby settlement. And we were greeted by the community. And in the foreground, they had a survey photograph of their community. And in the back, you can see something they'd created for our visit. And it literally says a vision map for their community. And when I questioned them on their design decisions, for example, the symbolic trees at the bottom, why is the landscape there? They would explain that that was the direction that the hurricanes would come. And then I said, what is the white building in the middle? Ah, the white building in the middle is a sanctuary. And that would enable us to find protection. We would not have to leave our community in the event of a hurricane warning. Then I talked about the space to the north. And they said, ah, that's a swamp. But we would see the swamp filled. And I realized that I could have been talking to a group of students in a school of architecture. And I said, who was responsible for this? And of course, the ladies on the right, who ranged in age from kind of grandchildren to grandmas, they were responsible for this extraordinary design vision. And that gave us the clue that perhaps models and graphics would be a way to work with a community like this to try to effect that transformation of standards. And so our first working example was with a fishing community. And here you can see very clearly how it was before. And these images just take us through, that red dot. If the arrow is pointing, it's pointing along the road which is parallel to the coast. It's the kind of coastal route. It's not really a road. And this is just to give you a feel of that community. And our starting point was to identify, with the help of the Tata Foundation, it was a joint project between our foundation and theirs, we identified that the power groups who made the decisions in the community were the fishermen, and then there was the business group. And that led to the emphasis of the red line at the bottom. And if you could retain the image from the past, the dwellings have been taken from there because they're vulnerable to the hurricanes. The swamp to the north has been filled. That's a relocation for expanding the housing. And then the business group, you'll see that diagonal route. The diagonal route in that community is where all the shops, the commerce, the informal trading would take place. So the businessmen wanted that route strengthened, improved. The fishermen wanted the coast improved. And amazingly, the women wanted more safety, more security. And their contribution was the lines that run at right angles to the water. And so there was an increase from 50% to something like 93% in terms of access. And that we were using models, working with the community, and encouraging them to contribute to the process, to identify their desires, how to overcome some of the shortfalls. And that model then became the basis for a town meeting and voting in favor of the master plan. And again, quite interestingly, the predominant group are the women. They're the real creative driving force behind the community. The fishermen, obviously, creating the livelihood. And as in any project, in any city in the world, all of these decisions have to be filtered through the various committees, the various groups within the civic authorities who have a responsibility for health, for traffic, for movement, and eventually, just again, a glimpse into the process, the use of models for those public spaces. And the revolution over a 12-month period of this project is that it moved that community one step towards the individual house with the individual bathroom. It's a transition period. It moved it from outdoor toilets to latrines. So it was a significant step along the way and created a network of public spaces. So really, that process is very, very similar to the transformation of Trafalgar Square, a space in the heart of the United Kingdom. All the distances are measured from Trafalgar Square to the various towns, cities throughout the nation. So it's a highly symbolic space. And at the time that we undertook the challenge to transform that space, to humanize it, to make it work better, essentially by closing the road to the north of the square as a setting for the important National Gallery and so on. Now, at the time that we started this study, that was a traffic roundabout, and it was really dangerous. You can see a member of the team dodging the traffic, and eventually the pedestrians would find themselves literally in steel pens for protection against the traffic. So, in the end, making one small but very significant change by closing this road, and you can see the historic National Gallery on the left, that was transformed into this space. And the heart of Trafalgar Square had been dominated by a few tourists feeding the pigeons. That was a kind of deserted space, and that was then opened up to the historic background. And now that has been referred to Trafalgar Square as the living room of London. It's a venue for outdoor theatre, cultural events. If we try to quantify the effects of those changes, which occurred at the same time as a move to introduce congestion charging to improve the quality of air and movement, we had a times 13 factor in terms of pedestrian movement. So an incredible acceleration of walking and cutting the time across the square by half, reducing traffic congestion by some 30%, and reducing carbon dioxide more than 16%, and other noxious gases. And that congestion charge injects annually something like £122 million into the city economy to subsidize and improve the quality of public transport. We're talking about infrastructure, and infrastructure is not just about communication in terms of walking across a square. It can be electronic communication. And here is the skyline of Barcelona at the time that this is leading up to the Olympics. And the Mayor Pascal Maragall was concerned about the proliferation of communication towers on the hillside, on the skyline overlooking the city. And a formidable task because these towers were planned by rival television outlets. So essentially what he said is, really, we should have one tower, and one tower should serve everybody. And that should be just a beautiful thing on the skyline. And, of course, that's an extraordinary challenge to take on the monopolies and all the lawyers and so on. This is just an extract from the presentation. It was a competition, international competition. And these sketches were comparing the traditional concrete mast and suggesting that something might preserve nature, might sit more delicately on the mountain, and could be a cable-supported structure. It hadn't been done before, but there was no technical reason why not. And here I just show an image at the time. This is the mayor congratulating myself and the team who'd presented when we learned that we'd won the competition. And this was the outcome. A guide structure, a lone tower, which successfully brought together all the competing interest into one tower. And that becomes symbolic from the city itself as a symbol. It became, in many ways, one of the many symbols of the Olympics. If infrastructure is about connectivity, then this viaduct in Mio, again the result of another competition. Traditionally, a viaduct is civil engineering. Inescapably, it's the domain of engineering. But the rules stipulated that this was too important to leave it to one profession alone, and that teams should be integrated with architects. So it was very much a collaborative endeavor. It is significantly higher than the Eiffel Tower, and at many times you drive across this literally above the clouds, and the sides are transparent, so you're aware it's probably the closest thing that you can get to flight without actually leaving the ground. And it dances very lightly across the terrain. So it's very much working with nature, and it's highly symbolic. A bridge in that environment has to be seen in the wider context of what was it like before the bridge. And before the bridge, especially in peak holiday periods, there was a massive surge of traffic through all the local roads. Literally 5 hours to traverse from one side of this valley to the other. This is in mid-France, in the Massif Central. And it's very difficult to quantify the effects of an intervention like this. There's no way that we can measure the pollution that's been reduced by private cars. But interestingly, just trucks going from Paris to Barcelona, because they have the black box, you can measure the difference in carbon emissions. And the difference is the equivalent of planting 40,000 trees of forest in terms of the reduction of the carbon dioxide, or the equivalent of the absorption of trees like that. If I move to an urban version, a mini version of that viaduct, it would be a small bridge, the first for centuries, that would connect as pedestrians from the rich north side of the Thames to the traditionally poor south side of the Thames. And this sketch, part of the competition submission, stated that it should be the most minimal, literally a blade of light. So it did not compete with the historic monument of St. Paul's Cathedral, which it would be on axis. And this is a new kind of suspension bridge. It's very, very low. Traditionally, a suspension bridge goes high, the cables go high. So the loads here are enormous, but they're low slung. So it is the most minimal intervention. You can see that it's on the axis of St. Paul's. You can also see that it's on the axis of Tate Modern. There are huge uptake in admissions to both Tate Modern and of visitors to St. Paul's, which we have not measured. But what we did do, we used with a group called Space Syntax, which I'd worked with when they were based in university. I'd encouraged them to come out of university and create a consulting arm. So we engaged them to predict the improvement in connectivity of pedestrian movements. And here you can see the way in which the computer is plotting the ripple effect from that small intervention. The reality is much, much better than our predictions. We predicted 4 million would cross. In reality, 8 million are crossing a year. It created twice as many jobs as predicted. There were no hotels. Now there are something like 60 hotels, new hotels in the area. And double blessing, the property values went high. But of course, that relates back to another issue, which could be the subject of a separate talk of the same length, which is the importance of affordable housing for those who really keep our communities going 24 hours a day. But as I say, that's another issue. Connectivity is very much at the heart of our society, mobility. And here this map just shows the invisible lines of communication in the sky, the air routes, the aerial navigation. And applying some of our ideas born in the 1960s at the birth of the Green Movement, taking the traditional airport terminal at that time and reinventing that. What do I mean by that? If I try to diagram this, you can see that all the heavy ductwork and machinery is sitting up there in the ceiling. Very, very little contact with nature, with the world outside, and a huge amount of energy being consumed by all those light fittings. So if I did a diagram of that, you can see the machinery sitting on the roof, you can see the pipes, and very difficult to maintain, to access. You have to use a forklift truck, and you can't stop an airport. It's 365 days a year. So our move, which looks very, very simple, but actually seemed to take an eternity to finally discover, was literally to turn it upside down, turn it on its head. So all that stuff in the roof goes in an undercroft below. So suddenly, with a cantilever structure, you can get big spans, and you really can open it up to nature, sunlight, movement of the clouds, and that becomes completely transformational. Interestingly, it has its equivalent in the world of flight, and as a passionate aviator, I mean, I just love everything that flies, but I can draw an analogy between the trussed biplanes of the past and the original model of the air terminal. And the transformation is very much like the transformation in the aircraft itself. It's a cantilevered structure, and it's pared down. It's much more minimal. It's doing more with less, to use the adage. And just a glimpse of the evolution of that thinking in Hong Kong, the way in which the structure, the grain of the building encourages the movement towards the aircraft. And I described it really as an analog experience in a digital age. So it's very much about connecting with nature, with the views, and knowing where you are so that you can navigate those spaces without needing the help of signs and numbers and symbols. And again, to the ultimate in scale, the Beijing airport. And here in all these examples, you can see the connectivity of the public transport in the foreground and the main terminal in the background. And it's very much about light, it's about movement. So if I took a cross-section through the airport itself, you can see that it's filled with light, the spans have increased, so it's a celebratory space. And in a way, the airports are like the train stations of the past. They're the gateways to the city, and they're symbolic of the nation. So they're more than just a terminal. And there are all kinds of analogies drawn here by locals in Beijing. They see affinities with the symbolism of dragons in the roof lights. That's accidental, if you like. Much more considered is to consciously introduce the color of the roofs of the Forbidden City as a color of the airport itself. I hear it's kind of, there are a number of fashions, and one of the fashions in currency is to question the validity of doing buildings for air travel. I would argue that the buildings deserve the maximum attention, like any other kind of building in the world, to reduce the energy, to make them more sustainable. And to put it in context, aviation is responsible for 2% of greenhouse gas emissions, compared with shipping, for example. And if you take a cruise liner, a cruise passenger is consuming twice as much energy as an airline passenger. So I think it's very important to put these issues into the wider context. And at the same time, I think, again, when we come to energy, and energy is the heart of combating climate change. And if I look at the realities of how can I say, mortality, of deaths caused by the generation of energy, something like 10 million people die every year through poor air quality, many of them children, from heating, cooking by fossil fuels. And remember also that at the moment, 80% of electricity is generated by fossil fuels. And the renewables, which account for about 10%, need a fossil fuel backup because of battery technology so far. And I would argue passionately in favor of nuclear, which is very, very controversial. It's outside of the manifesto, the declaration of San Marino. But at the same time, it does refer to clean energy. And if you look at the deaths related to a unit of energy, in this case, 1,000 terawatt hours, then in China, as you can see, we're talking about 100,000 coal globally. Excuse me, we're talking about 170,000 coal, in average globally, 100,000. And right down there is nuclear at 90. And that's including all the disasters from the early generation power plants. So really, just putting that into the wider context, you can, if you relate that, if you have an abundance of clean energy, then you can convert seawater to jet fuel. And at the same time, you're not only enabling the existing fleet to go green with no changes to the technology, the engines, the hardware, but at the same time, you're decarbonizing the oceans, which at the moment are a major carbon sink. So it was some of that thinking which percolated into another example, which I was talking yesterday about the importance of recycling. And that is a very important part of the San Marino Declaration, whether that's recycling of materials, recycling of waste to energy, or recycling a building. And recycling the Reichstag as a new parliament to bring together, to unify the separate East Germany and West Germany. The clue was very much in the ecology of biomass that would be a kind of energy manifesto. So the cupola, which was the addition, and which symbolically brought the public into Parliament, something like 2 million people, more than 2 million people a year, to ascend into that dome, which was part of the energy generator of the building. And here we can see ascending the ramp and looking down symbolically. And these were the politicians who who voted for this recommendation, which we made as architects, that symbolically the public should be above them, the politicians, who are answerable to the public. So I can describe this in social terms, or I could describe it in environmental terms, because the mirrored cone is reflecting natural light deep into the building. It's working as an extract aerodynamically to create suction, to pull fresh air through the building. Aquifers are deep below ground. So this is essentially using solar cells, all the elements of sustainability to create a zero carbon building. Now, there are various ways in which we as a profession can measure the sustainability of a building. BREEAM is a very popular one. LEED is the American example, but there are many different kinds. The reality is they're a very, very significant step in the right direction, but they don't go far enough. They don't take embedded carbon in the materials, for example. So we have recently, with a project which I'm just going to give you a glimpse of, is still just finishing construction, it's not been occupied, but it was the building that we showed at COP26, and it's the most sustainable project that we've done so far in our 6 decades or more of practice. It took an industrial building on the edge of Madrid. Interestingly, this building produced fossil fuel gas at the turn of the century for the city. And repurposing that, recreating it, and surrounding it by greenery, by gardens that would absorb carbon dioxide, and also create public access, a new park for the local community, as well as the headquarters that would eventually be accommodated here. So you can see that the interior has been cleaned up. More glazing has been introduced in the roof to reduce the need for artificial light. It's a wooden structure. These are the gardens. So that is, again, another example of recycling. It is, in effect, a one-planet building. It relates directly to the Paris Accord, goes far beyond the codes. I now show a glimpse of 2 projects which are in a line of buildings that a kind of building that we've tried to pioneer since the 1960s. And that is to say, of course, it's really important how the building relates to the wider issues of planetary global warming. But it's also important to relate it to the health of those people who work in the building. And these last 2 are in the line of buildings that pull in fresh air. Those fins are like the gills of a fish. They pull in air, they attenuate the noise, they filter the dirt, and in the same principles in Cupertino. What is interesting about these buildings is that it's moving air over vast distances. So these are not tall, skinny buildings. They're low, but very, very deep buildings. And the way in which the air is pulled is related to the glazing and the eyebrows. The eyebrows are like light shelves. They reflect light, and because they're very shiny, reflective, they bring the landscape into the building. And they reduce glare. And on part of the circular elevation, they're shading devices. They're also symbolic. They're the DNA, the identifier, the symbol of the building. And here you can see how they encourage the movement of air through and exhausted out. And in this approach, the structure is doing more than just holding up the building. The structure, which is concrete, and again, I'll come to another fashion because there's a current tendency to say concrete is not sustainable. That's like saying we can't afford water. I mean, concrete is the second most used material after water on the planet. There are a lot of moves to decarbonize that, a lot of very valuable research and feedback underway. But it's not the material itself, it's very much how you use it. You'll notice in this edge space and deeper in the building There are no suspended ceilings. The structure, which is concrete, is polished, highly reflective. It's a noble material. It's treated like the most precious stone. And that is, it's not just holding up the building, it's a prefabricated element. And the cross-section of that is not just the reinforcing bars, which are adding to the strength, it's small bore pipes, which are pulling hot and cold water. Add all this together, you're saving a huge amount on external wall. So the total sustainability story, especially if you take the recycling into effect, 100% of the concrete of the 24 existing buildings has been fed back into the concrete of the new building. So again, it's really trying to avoid some of the fashionable aspects and really coming down to the statistics, whether that is a building or whether it's a source of energy. The building is, how can I say, is almost secondary to the landscape. You think about a building and you've got a landscape around it. Here, the approach was the landscape and then fitting the building into it. So the outcome of that is that we're seeing here a glimpse of some 10,000 trees which have been planted and which are responsible for absorbing 200 tons of carbon dioxide every year. So the building itself is zero energy. In many ways, if you take the bigger picture, it's carbon restorative. Now, that, like any design decision, is rooted in research. And that new generation of deeper, naturally ventilated, but climate-controlled, only arose out of creating the equivalent of the office here, the office for Bloomberg, in a warehouse surrounded by all the equipment that would simulate the weather, the most extreme conditions. So that was made possible by research. And in the same way, when I and my colleagues started in practice, we could say with tremendous amount of passion and conviction that if you had a building where there was fresh air, where there were views, sunlight, that it would be good for you. It seemed obvious. But of course, if somebody was going to challenge that, then they could say, well, you can't prove it. The difference now is that you can prove it. These are cells where individuals, teams have taken tests. Below that floor is a plant room that can simulate the conditions of a conventional building with recirculating air, a central system, and where you can simulate the kind of building that I just showed. And the results are overwhelming. I mean, this is a tiny glimpse of those tests. Essentially, the brown is a conventional building, the middle green is a green building, and the light green is rather like the two buildings that I described. They're kind of super green in terms of their environment. So huge improvement in human performance. Innovation can come out of research or it can come out of incentives. And I was persuaded, I didn't need too much persuasion, I should add, I was persuaded to add my name and to participate in Switzerland in an award that would, for the first time, award not just energy efficiency, but the balance between energy efficiency and architectural aesthetics. And the results over the decade or so that it's been in use are really quite amazing. You won't be able to read the fine print, but essentially these are generating up to 7 or 8 times the amount of energy that they consume, and they are importing that excess energy from the solar systems back into the national grid, or they're charging electric cars. And it's probably just worth noting in passing, again, it's very fashionable to think that if we have an electric car, it's a clean car. The electric cars that would be charged from these dwellings, buildings, industrial buildings, would be clean. But if that energy that electrical energy is being produced by a fossil fuel power plant that essentially is still a dirty car. If we move on and conclude, then really what I've tried to do here is what I was asked to do yesterday, and that was not just to launch help to launch the declaration, but to try to bring it to life, to say, please join us all in signing up to this, whoever you are, in terms of your impact on the environment, whether you're an architect, engineer, whether you're a politician, a civic leader, whether you're a developer, whatever role you play, bring it into action. So I've tried to share that, some of that with you today. Thank you very much. Thank you. Was too long? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
It was very much needed, I think.
Thank you.
So, we have collected a series of questions, so I'm just, let's say, messenger of a series of questions that we received from the public and from the orders of the architects, from architects and students. So,
Do we sit down?
yes. I really enjoyed your last invitation to, let's say, for everybody here in this room and beyond, to participate in this action towards making the Declaration of San Marino a document that becomes practice in a way. So the first question is a question that we received from architect Luca Morganti on behalf of the Order of the Engineers and Architects of the Republic of San Marino, and it has to deal with the declaration itself. So, quote, "To follow the principles of the San Marino Declaration, how will it be possible to return architects to their rightful role as project directors, since their work often comes up against choices imposed by a wide range of interests, political and speculative primarily?"
I think that architecture is driven by constraints. I think it's at the core of design, of designing anything, whether it's a building, whether it's a gadget. It's always balancing constraints. And I think that's a constant. There's a part of the talk that I gave yesterday where I talked about the power of individuals, behind any of the projects that I've shown, there's always been somebody who cared passionately about it. In so many times, and I'm sure I speak for many in the audience, we're confronted by intermediaries who are project managers. It's very important to get to the source of a project. So when I showed the Apple building, Steve Jobs cared passionately about the people who worked at Apple. Mike Bloomberg, as an individual, cared. So in those projects, you're dealing with an individual who cares passionately. In a more institutional project like the Reichstag, where in a typical meeting, you look at the parliamentary hall, and it's a sea of faces, but there's one person, Rita Zusmut, who cared passionately. And if it wasn't for her, the Reichstag would never have happened. And for Duisburg, it was an individual, a civic leader, who handed over to another civic leader. So it's the architect, paradoxically, has no power. As I was saying yesterday, I cannot go on a site and tell anybody to do anything. I don't have that power. On the other hand, I do have the power of advocacy. And if I took Trafalgar Square, for example, the centre of London in the early 90s, like Trafalgar Square and Horse Guards, which I showed yesterday, Horse Guards Parade, a noble space right next to Whitehall, was just full of cars, disfiguring the space. And with two other architects, one my ex-partner and friend Richard Rogers, another Ricky Burdett, and one or two others, but we started a groundswell of opinion. The Horse Guards Parade, I made a sketch of it without cars, and I got the Evening Standard interested in that. And that had a ripple effect, and we ended up with a major meeting in a public hall, Whitehall, and we persuaded the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, to attend. I brought Pascal Maragall to share his experiences in London of what he'd done in Barcelona. The outcome was the cars left Horse Guards Parade. It's a noble space now. It's not a car park. And it led to the competition eventually for Trafalgar Square. So a very long answer, I think it is, and also I find that I'm always coming across architects who have moved out of the practice of architecture. They moved into political positions, or they moved into journalistic. Interestingly, I gave an interview just before I came here, and it was an individual who was saying, you know, I studied architecture in Milan, I then went to McGill, now I'm doing this. So I think as a profession, we have a unique role to play in terms of bringing like-minded professionals from different disciplines, from being able to bridge across public opinion, and to use, in the end, the power of advocacy.
I would add or summarize that probably constraints are the driver of our work, of the architect's
Yes, I mean,
work.
I won't go into the personal, private details, but I was recently invited to do a project, and there are absolutely no constraints. And for the first time in my life as a designer, I really found myself kind of scratching my head in, you know, when everything is possible and there are no constraints, design then becomes really, really challenging.
Can imagine. The second question, still from Luca Morganti, is on the WTC project here in San Marino. And so the question goes, what impressions did you get when you first came to our republic, especially in the area near the state border where the WTC project was developed? What project idea did that place suggest to you? A place in need of architecture and especially urban redevelopment? Do you think that the WTC project has achieved its goals?
You would have to ask the owner. Or you'd have to canvass the public because it's in the public domain. What do I think are the lessons of that, and in the wider context of the question San Marino? First of all, the World Trade Center is, by comparison with so much of the development around it, is much more dense, is more compact. So it's making less of an imprint on its site. And in that sense, it's inherently more sustainable and is using the precious resource of land, I would argue, more wisely. The issue, the wider issue of San Marino, perhaps I go back to the conversation that I had with this journalist in the square outside the Parliament building, a short walk from here. And the question was put to me, do I see now in terms of the issues of sustainability, combating climate change, all those issues which are, every time we open a newspaper now, is there going to be a new kind of city? Well, of course, there are going to be new cities. There are going to be new kinds of cities, but the point that I was making is that the inspirational model is the compact, walkable, pedestrian-friendly European city. And if you address the issues of movement, if you look at the layering in terms of new cities, you look at the lessons from a city like San Marino, just beautiful outside spaces. I mean, those are timeless as examples. And of course, sprawl is the enemy. It is consuming more energy. It's more, that may, I mean, you might argue then, well, suburbia is there in large tracts on some continents, like United States. I would hope that the revolution in mobility to autonomous cars might transform that with injections to make it more socially inclusive. So, long answer, short, précis, the European city is the model of the future.
Talking of which, you just mentioned San Marino and the place we are in, and I would, let's say, select this question, which is on the architecture of San Marino by Michelucci, De Carlo, and other architects, and the autonomy of architecture, which is something we already, let's say, discussed in the first question. In the Republic of San Marino, there is a fair number of architectural works made by important architects. Unfortunately, many people have noticed that quality works do not get the visibility they deserve in the urbanistic confusion of our small territory, and nowadays almost everywhere in the world. So we ask, how do we let quality emerge? And what other tools do you think could be used? Is a good project enough? Does something else need to be done?
I think we all need to be promoting quality. Quality in urban life, quality in the individual buildings and the public spaces. And that doesn't mean spending more money. Mm-hmm. Often, it means spending less money, but spending it more wisely. And to return to my earlier mantra, to use our powers of advocacy and the quest for quality. And not all of the projects that I showed came out of a competitive environment, but many did. So whether it's the incentives of awards, whether it's performance related, I think we can all play a role in that. And certain things have not changed. I mean, good quality, whether it's a public space or a building, is about patronage. And patronage is absolutely timeless. I mean, it goes back to the Middle Ages. It goes back to the birth of this amazing republic. Mm-hmm.
Since we went back to the medieval ages, I will go back and back and back, because the next question is about ancient Greece. So the ancient Greek term techne indicated the set of rules that governed human activity and referred to artistic creation as the operational capacity of technical production. Do you believe that the architecture of tomorrow, in addition to giving a concrete response to the environmental crisis as emerged from the San Marino Declaration, must also bring poetry back in technique? So can we say that artistry will remain an unavoidable fact of architecture to come? Do you think it's possible today, when there is more and more a group of designers working together to take the place of the solitary artist?
I'm not sure I know where to start on this, but one of the schools of architecture that I was privileged to attend was a master's course at Yale. And the dean was Paul Rudolph. And Rudolph was an extraordinary teacher and a very talented architect. And he would bring a succession of individuals as visiting critics who didn't necessarily subscribe to the work of Paul Rudolph. So he was very self-confident in that respect. He could bring in his enemies as critics and critics to us as students. And one of the projects was a high-rise building. And I've never, as a student, done a high-rise building. And most people, I think, the class went to the books on high-rise buildings. They saw that every high-rise building was a center core of structure, of elevators, escape stairs, with a periphery of space around it. And I said to Paul Rudolph, I said, I've never done a high-rise building. I don't know anything about high-rise buildings. I'd like to work with an engineer. It's very difficult to understand the impact of that statement to an architect like Paul Rudolph, because Paul Rudolph believed passionately and sincerely that architecture was the sole domain of architects, and that the architect conceived and then handed it out to other people to make it stand up, to make it work environmentally, and I was challenging that. And Paul, as a great teacher, found me an engineer. And I worked with this engineer and designed a building which had no central core. The cores were dispersed and they became, in part of the structure. And as a fellow student who later became the dean, Bob Stern, of Yale, he was to observe, when we all came back together on an anniversary occasion, that that was the birth of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. And in the early years of practice, and it was a husband and wife practice, way back in the 1960s, our first partner was an environmental engineer. The point that I'm making is that I think that one of the fallacies is that if you engage with other professions, you surrender your ability, you dilute design. For me, it is a total reverse. It empowers me and my colleagues and the team that I work with, having more knowledge of a situation, whether that's environmentally, structurally, enables me. Nobody ever uses the word beauty, but I don't see how you can separate the two. I was again privileged to work for the last 12 years of his life with Buckminster Fuller, who said, when I finished a design, if it doesn't feel beautiful, I feel I failed. Not talking that during the process. We're not doing that. But if we're not striving to produce something which improves the quality of life, either through beauty, performance, for me, I can't separate. I can't separate the technology from the humanity.
Talking about the profession still, we have a question from architect Gabriella Filomeni Marangelli on behalf of the Order of the Architects, Planners, Landscape Architects and Heritage of the province of Rimini, and is about, let's say, the scope of our profession and the role of the architect today. Our profession over the centuries has been transforming in ways never imagined. What do you ask from today's architects? Should he need ever greater and varied skilled, I would say he or she, to address the issues of sustainability, circularity, and inclusiveness, or are we moving in the direction of large multidisciplinary associated firms? How will the architect of today manage to become the architect of tomorrow, which we have not imagined yet?
The risk of repetition, it's being able to harness the skills of the specialist skills of others and to integrate and to harmonize those skills. And the tools, I talked about my past as a student. If I move myself out of it and recall a point that Frank Gehry was making, I mean, Frank is the first to admit that his architecture could not happen without the technology of the computer, the ability of the computer to model. But I think there are two things that come out of this. First of all, Frank doesn't know how to switch the computer on, by his own admission, and I'm probably in the same rank. But the computer, indispensable in terms of its modeling. A lot of what I've shown would not have been possible without harnessing the technology of being able to simulate and predict, and to be the master of some of those three-dimensional geometries. But the computer is, in the end, everything that I hear about artificial intelligence notwithstanding, is like the pencil, another tool. And if you really want to look at three-dimensional geometries, go back to Gaudi before the computer. So I think it's harnessing the timeless traditions from the past with the technology of the present and the future.
I think that the people who are, let's say, who could be more interested probably in the declaration, I won't say most, but I think the declaration is a big inspiration for students. That's why, let's say, we also collected some questions from the students for you. So the first one goes, we see in you a renowned architect who, over time, has been able to inspire a generation of architecture and engineering students. At this moment, we feel lucky and honored to have you as a guest in our little republic. We imagine that you too, like us, during your studies and at the beginning of your career, had some reference, inspiring figures, or architecture that aroused such feelings as to characterize your first works. Could you tell us who or what you were influenced by and some anecdotes about your university career?
I guess that if I tried to do a list of those who've inspired me, it would be a separate talk and it would go on for a long time because the list is kind of endless.
We need to do another lecture for that.
Sorry?
We have to do another lecture for that.
Anecdotes. I was always interested in what are now called vernacular buildings. In other words, I wasn't aware of it at the time as a student, but not long after I graduated, there was an exhibition and a book related to it called Architecture Without Architects. So unconsciously, I was fascinated by the vernacular. And I guess that although I've always been grateful for extraordinary teachers, I found myself challenging convention as a student. So every third year, during the summer vacations, traditionally at Manchester, you did a measured drawing. And you did a measured drawing of a work of architecture. And every year, the results would be pinned up. There'd be watercolor washes, there'd be pencil drawings. And architecture was always Georgian architecture. So you went out and you measured, took notes, measured the building, and then draw to scale plans, elevations, sections. Always Georgian architecture. So I challenged that, which is a very risky thing to do as I look back. And I measured a barn, and I measured a windmill. And I measured the inner workings of the windmill, the cogs on the wooden wheels, the way that the gearing worked. And that was quite challenging. Fortunately, I was rescued because I submitted it for an RIBA prize for measured drawings, which delivered a £100 award. And a £100 award in the early 1950s was the equivalent of several £1,000s today. So everybody was very happy, but in that case, the kind of challenge worked. Other anecdotes, I suppose, that the very first design assignment in the first year was always for two buildings, a boathouse and a cottage. And the boathouse was always on the water, and the cottage was always above. And again, looking back, I did a building, one building, that combined the boathouse and the cottage. And there was a glass wall between. And I imagined this boat as the kind of Ferrari of the water. And I think that was influenced by a book that I read before I realized that I could be an architect. And it was Corbusier in my local library, called Towards a New Architecture. And I still remember that kind of double-page spread. There was the Acropolis detail on the one side and the detail of a Caproni hydroplane on the other. And again, if I look at some of the buildings that we've done, they're a single building and bringing all those buildings under one roof. So in a way, there is a link between one student's past and, one professionally present.
Mm-hmm. Continuing with the questions of the students, in a world that must now move towards an imperative kind of sustainability, construction costs are among the major obstacles to overcome. To make architecture of quality truly inclusive and reachable by people, approachable by people with low profitability, what advice could you suggest making the design and construction of works more economically sustainable?
I think I would just point to the example that I showed of the concrete structure of Apple. In other words, it's doing more with less. It's integrating. And there's no reason why that should be more expensive. Paradoxically, I think it could even be more economic.
We have one last question,
Right.
and then a surprise for you. So
I've had one surprise this morning.
The COVID-19 pandemic has, in part, changed the concept of living space. We passed through the principle of making living spaces as compact as possible, consolidating the idea that the house can act mainly as a dormitory, also to be able to limit purchase prices, to the need to have truly habitable spaces and possibly in contact or in continuity with the external environment and green areas. Will this be the main challenge for architects in the near future, to transform current buildings and cities into green buildings and forest cities, or will the real challenge be to make buildings and cities energetically passive?
I think it's integrating all of those different scenarios. So I think it's maximizing recycling, whether that's a historic building like the Reichstag. What I haven't shown and what I've not been able, so far not given the opportunity, if you like, with colleagues, is to take an obsolescent office building and transform that into habitable dwellings. So I think inevitably the future is about maximizing to a greater degree existing buildings, recycling, and new build, and feeding back all the lessons that I believe as a profession and collectively we've absorbed over time. the lessons of history and the opportunities for the present with new materials, new technologies, and maximizing that opportunity.
Probably the past is there to inspire us for the
Of
future
course.
solutions. So, to help me with this surprise, I would like to call Luca Zanotti to the stage, President of the Board of the Architects and Engineers of the Republic of San Marino. So, Luca Zanotti would like to include you as a honorary member of the Board of the Architects and Engineers of San Marino. And so you will be opening this new, let's say, section of the order. You're the first one to be entitled an honorary membership to their order. And they would like you also to include your dedication to the book.
Wow. Great honor. Fantastic. Your pin. Fantastic. Thank you. And it's personalized. Wonderful.
I would then ask Paola Deda to join us on stage, and Armando Zambrano, President of the National Council of Engineers of Italy.
So I'm the first of your order, and I'm the first architect of the Augusta. Yes. So.
Golden book.
Wow.
Ad honorem. And I would like to ask you.
Sure.
Ci vuoi far tu da traduttrice, Paola?
Sorry?
Ci vuoi far tu da traduttrice? Se ci può fare una
certo.
dedica su questo libro, dalla prima pagina come il primo architetto iscritto?
So if they would like you to write a message to them on the first page, this is the book of the honorary members. You are the first, and they would like you to just write a little.
Wow,
Either
of
now
course.
Or after, whenever.
Could I take it away, do it, and
mettiamo un
return
passo
it?
indietro.
Is that possible?
Prende e ve lo ridà dopo.
Because I could arrange for it to come back, and I
Yes.
can do it properly then, rather than
Yes, you can.
super.
Thank you so much.
Ah, great pleasure, great honor.
Again,
Thank you. Thank you.
Armando Zambrano.
È un regolamento della
abilitazione all'esercizio della professione dei tecnici, ingegneri, architetti.
Well, this is the regulation
Stato Pontificio del 1800
dating back to mid-19th century. This is the reproduction of that regulation.
Thank you again. Luke Foster.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, you are all invited to the refreshments in the square in front of the Titano Theater, and we invite authorities to follow the staff of the theater to the Ridotto instead. Thank you.
Oh, wow.